Hello everyone, this is Alejandro, and in this tutorial we will talk about variables. Variables are a new feature on Spline that enables you to do highly interactive experiences. In this tutorial we will see what variables are, how you can use variables with your objects, and how you can combine variables with events and actions to create interactive experiences that can be simple or very complex. Alright, let's begin. So what are variables? Variables in essence are just values that can change or be modified. You can think of variables as assets that can be assigned to multiple objects. The main difference is that a variable is a lot more granular. A variable can be just a number, text, or even a boolean value of true and false. You can combine variables with events to trigger actions, and you can even combine them with conditional logic to generate actions that are driven by mathematical expressions. But the best way to understand what variables are is just to create one. So let's just do that. Alright, so creating a new variable is actually quite simple. You can go to the variables manager by clicking on the variable section here at the bottom, and it will open this panel, and from here you will see that there are already some default options. You can also click on the plus icon to see the same options. So for now I'm just going to create a number variable. On this side you will have the name, and you can double click on this to rename it. Let's say my cool number. And on the right side you have the value, and you can also click on it and you can have your own value. Now you can also create other variables like a boolean or a string. A string is a string of characters, and a boolean is a value that can be either true or false. There are also other type of variables which are called dynamic variables like time, counter, and random. But we will talk about them later on the video. Okay, so how can you use these variables? So it's actually quite simple. You can select your object, and then you can hover on any property and you will see a dot icon. So not all properties accept variables, but when they do, they will show this little icon on the corner. And if you click on them, it will open the selector. From this selector, you can choose the variable. So in this case, I have the number variable. As soon as I click, you see that my object moves to the position 100, and you will see that there is this little highlight here. And if you want to detach your variable, you can click on it and you can choose none, or type a different number again and it will choose delete the attachment. Now let me undo that. Well, if you go to the variables and you change the number from here, you will see that it's updating automatically. So that means that now you have control over this object position from your variable's value here. But you can also control the value of a variable by creating actions within events. So I'm going to create a new event, and from this event, which is going to be, let's say, a mouse down, I want to set variable. So I'm going to choose the same variable, which is my cool number, and now I need to decide what is going to be the new value. So for example, this could be 200. So currently it's 100, and now when I click on this object, it will be 200. So let's go to a play mode and see if that works. I'm going to click on the object, and you can see that essentially it's now moving. But what if I want this object to move 100 units every time that I click on the object? So for example, I can say the value of this variable is always going to be the current value plus 100 units. So now I have a little simple expression here, and then if I go to a play mode, every time that I click on this object, now it's moving 100 units. And let's also maybe just set this to be 0 by default. Alright, so now let's see how we can use other variables like the string variable. So I'm just going to create a text object here. It's going to be just hello, and I'm going to move this object to the top. I'm going to use the center, a little bigger, and perhaps it will be just pure white. Now I would like to show the number variable instead of this text in here. So that's actually quite simple. I just go to the text object, and then in content I will select my number variable. So I would like to choose this one. You can see by default is 0, but if I go to play mode and I click on the object, now the text is displaying the latest current value. But what if I want to create something that happens over time? For example, let's say that I want this cube to rotate every second. This is a use case for dynamic variables. So dynamic variables are variables that they change over time. Like for example, we had time, and if I display this to you, time can be just literally your time, like what's the time that you have. You can change the way that the value is created by accessing to these options. By default, it's a clock. It could also be a timer, and it could be a stopwatch. So how is a clock, right? If you go to a play mode, you will see it literally is just your current time, which for me right now is 8 a.m. And you can change the way the format of the time is. Like for example, maybe you just want hours and minutes, or maybe you just want just hours or just minutes. So if you're having, let's say this one, maybe I don't want the AM, so I just want the hours, you can do that as well. And on the other side, we have the counter, right? So a counter is a number that is increasing over time. By default, the value is 0 and the interval is every 1 second. So that means that every 1 second, this counter is going to increase 1 step the value, right? So if I go to a play mode, actually let me assign this counter right now. If I go to a play mode, you will see every new second, it will increase the number, right? If you change the interval to be, let's say 2 seconds, that means that every 2 seconds, this number will increase. So it's gonna take longer, right? It's basically twice as slow as before. The final one is called random, and random is gonna give you a random number each time. So for example, here, if we choose random, you will see that it will just show you a random number each time. In the settings for this variable, you can see that there's a minimum, there's a maximum, and you can choose whatever value is gonna be from the minimum or the maximum. All right, so now that we know what the dynamic variables are, let's see how we can use this, right? So, well, the cool thing about dynamic variables is that because they change over time, if we assign them to an object property, let's say, for example, I want to change the rotation of this based on one of these values. So I can go maybe to here and select counter, and then I want to control the counter, right? So I want this to go every second to increase 10, and that will be like degrees, and I don't want any m value, so this will be rotating forever 10 steps every 1 second. So let's see if that's gonna work. So you can see there that it's rotating every 10 seconds. Now maybe we can just choose here also counter, just to be less confusing. So there is 10, 20, 30, 40, and so on. But the interesting part is that if you go to these variable settings, maybe you want the movement to be more smooth. So maybe instead of 1 second, you want this to be 0.01 second, and the step maybe will be just 1 degree. So that means that when you go to a play mode, you will have a much more smoother value. So your object will be rotating there forever. You can actually assign the same number to something like your position, right? So maybe it will be moving in this position as well. So I can choose my counter here. So now it will be going up. By the way, if I'm doing this and I click the object, because I already have the other logic, the object is also moving. So you can combine that as well. Okay, so this is slightly different, and now my cube is green by default, and there is another state for this cube that changes the color to yellow. And what I would like to happen is that when this number here reaches 100, I want to change the color of this object to yellow, right? So how can I do that? Well, there is a new event in the events settings that is called variable change. And from here I can choose my counter number, and then I can also use a new action here that is called conditional. So the conditional allows me to check for something and detect that if that is true or not, right? So I would like to check for the counter, and I will say, well, if the counter is, let's say, bigger or equal than 100, I would like to do something. And the something that I would like to do is essentially just a transition for the cube to go from the current state to the state 1. And it's gonna take maybe 0.3 seconds. Now let's go to a play mode and see if that happens. There it is. As soon as it reaches 100, it changes to yellow. Now, maybe it's not 100, right? Maybe it could be just 50. And perhaps in this state change, we can modify the object even more. Maybe it could be something like this. It could be even smaller. So maybe it's like an interesting animation. So now let's play this. And you can see that it converts. So you can check for values, and if the expression here is true, then your condition will execute the actions. Otherwise, you can execute other actions in here. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that if you're changing this object from states, and at the same time you're changing the object from variables, you might encounter a conflict because the system is trying to change the object in two different ways. Alright, in this example I want to show you how you can use another concept, which are system variables, to control the object properties from them. I have this cylinder here and I want to create a new event that is going to be variable change. And in this case, I would just like to check for the counter. Whenever this counter is changing, I want to do something about. So let's set a variable. In this case, let's set my cool number to be one of these. Mouse position to the mouse hit position 3D are essentially system variables. For example, I would like to set the cool variable to be the mouse position X, and then I would like to assign the cool variable to my position X on the cube. Also, maybe I can divide this by 10 because I assume the number will be very high. So then you can see that when I move my mouse from one side to another, my object is moving as well, and it's basically the mouse just moving the object in the X position in this case. Now, another idea is that you can check for another object movements, right? So in this case, for example, maybe this sphere is moving. So for example, let's create another state for this sphere, and maybe this sphere is moving like this, and let's create like a start transition here. So here, instead of checking for the counter, we can check for an object property change, and the object should be the sphere and the property should be the position X. So now for my cool number value, instead of the previous one, we can assign the object sphere position X, and then we can use this variable within our position X for the cylinder. So that means that when the sphere is moving in this direction, the cylinder is going to be moving in this direction. So if we go to the play mode, you can see that that's what happened. Now, because this is a transition, we can just go back and forward. So let's just make an infinite loop that is going from ping pong. So now it's just moving like that forever. Right? I can maybe multiply these times 2. So now this is going to be moving twice as fast as this sphere. And you can see that is essentially what is happening. Okay, so now that we know the basics of how variables work and how the event system works with variables, let's see how this example here works. So let's go to the play mode. You can see that every time that I click these arrows, the object will move in the direction of the arrows. Now, we already saw how we can move the cube based on events, but in this case, the cube is being moved by an action that is being triggered from another object. So in this case, this object is actually the one that is triggering the position change of this object, and it's doing so by checking a conditional. And if we go to the play mode again, you can see that if I click here, once it reaches the maximum value, it will not go over that value. So the way this is working is there are 4 variables here, right? So there is the position X and position C, and then there is a minimum and a maximum value. So the maximum is 200 and the minimum is minus 200. So that means that the maximum that this object can move is either 200 here or 200 here, and the minimum will be 200, minus 200 and then minus 200. There is a conditional for each button that is checking, well, is the position X less than the maximum? And if it is so, then you can set the value to increase 100 units every time that you click on this object. And if you want to do it for a negative direction, it will be the same, but then you check, well, it's over the limit of minimum, then you decrease the number by 100 units, so it goes in the opposite direction, right? So it's the same thing. Now, at the same time, these buttons are doing something interesting because they're growing a little bit. So there is a new feature on the Spline that is the move. So previously you were able to choose between toggle and non-toggle, which means once. So now we have a tier option that is repeat each time. So that means that every time that you click on this object, it will repeat this transition from scratch. So you can see that when I click on it, it's always repeating the transition. Here's another example of how you can use variable to control objects. So if you go to the play mode and you click on these buttons, the size of the bars will either increase or decrease, and once they reach the limits, they will no longer go over them, right? So let's see how this logic works. The main logic for the bars are in the buttons. So if you go to the buttons on the container, we will see that there is a mouse down event. So on this mouse down event, there is a conditional, and the conditional is checking for some variables. Now let's see what variables we have here. So at the bottom we can see that we have just number variables for the size of the bars, and 500, 200, and 100. And then we have some other interesting variables like the text and then the percentage. So let's see first about the one here, which is just the number, right? So the number is checking, well, if the size of this object, which is based on the extrusion, and the maximum extrusion representing 100 will be just 500 units. So 500 units will be just 100, right? So if that number is less than 500, then increase the size of this variable 50 units. So that means that every time that you click on this button, it's going to increase 50 units unless it's bigger than 500. In that case, it will not increase the variable. For the minus, it will be the same, but it's going to be the reverse. So instead of increasing, it's going to be decreasing. Okay, so what about the text, right? So how's the text working? So the text is using here the column text, which is a string variable. There is a variable change that is checking for the value of the column 1 variable, which we saw before, and then it's setting the value of this another variable that is called the column 1 in percentage. So essentially it's just dividing this number by 5, so we get the equivalent of 500 in a 100% ratio. And then after that, it's just setting the value of the text to be a combination of the value in percentage, which go from 0 to 100, plus the little character for percentage. So this is something that you can do for strings. You can actually combine multiple strings, and then you can get something like this. In fact, if you want to change this by something else, for example, maybe another symbol, you go to a play mode, you will see that it will be this other symbol, right? But let me just undo that change. On this example, we can see how we can use a similar logic than the previous one to create a progress loader. And in this case, it's going from 0 to 100. And once it reaches 100, it just stops there. If we go to the variables, we can see there is only a few variables in here. There is a counter, and this counter goes from 0 to 100, right? And then we have a couple of number variables. If we go to the green object here, you can see that the angle variable is assigned to this object that is essentially controlling this number here. Now I don't want to break this, so let me just undo. You can see that this object is also controlling the main logic of everything. So there is a variable change event that is checking for the progress, which we saw before. This is a counter variable. When the counter is changing, the angle is setting the value to be a little expression here. So because the progress goes from 0 to 100, we multiply the progress times 360 degrees, which is the full spin, and then we divide by 100. And then we set the variable of the show number, which is going to be round number of the progress. So we want to make sure that the progress, which is the counter, is displayed in integer, so we're rounding this number. Now this is a new concept that we didn't discuss before, but within the expressions in here, you can also access to certain mathematical functions, and round is one of them. Round is basically taking a number that contains decimals, and it can round that number to be, let's say, an integer. So in this case, you will have just an integer value that does not contain decimals. And then after that, we take the show number and we add the percentage. Very similar to what we did in the bar chart. In this case, it's just for this numbering here. The text in here is using that last variable that is called percentage, right? Which combines this plus the character percentage. So now if we go to the play mode, you can see everything is working just fine. Alright, so here is a very simple example of how you can use variables. If we go to the play mode and then we click on this object, you will see that every time that I click, it increases the number, but also some interesting objects are falling from above. So let's see how all of this is working, right? So if I click on this object, I see that there is some steps and then there is a mouse down event. On the mouse down event, there's a couple of things that are happening. The first thing is that the transition is happening. So this is just increasing the size of everything. So we get the little bouncy effect. And then we have the important one, which is the set variable. In this case, what is happening is just that every time that you click on this object, it's setting the value of the likes to be 1 unit more. So the current value plus 1 unit every time that you click on it. It's also worth mentioning that this is also using the repeat each time, which is the feature that enables you to repeat this transition each time. Then we see that there is the create object. Now the create object is creating a new clone of a tiny heart. So let's see what a tiny heart is. So a tiny heart looks like it's this very small heart, and it's creating a new copy of that every time that you click on this object. And because we have physics enabled, and you can check here, there is physics, it will create this object, and this object already has dynamic, so it will fall by gravity. So you don't have to modify any of these because it's already by default, and then it's just falling. And then finally there is sound. So when you click on the button, a sound is played, and this sound is called tip, which is one of the sounds that you can get from the Spline library by default here. Okay, so in this example, we can see that when we move the handlers, the cube is changing the size, and it's also changing the round corner with this one in here. So this is actually like a very nice example of how to use variables. Now on the surface, this looks very complex, but if we go here to the variables, we can see there's only 4 variables, one for each handler. And then if we go to the handlers and we see that it's just using a drag and drop event, and on the drag behavior, it's only updating the slider tree variable by using the position itself. So basically when you're dragging this object, it's just assigning the position of the object to the slider tree variable, in this case the one that is corresponding to the object. So that's how you are then increasing the size, because if we click on the cube, we can see that for each of the axes there is a corresponding variable assigned, in this case 2, in this case 1, and finally for the corner, right? And then if we click here on the one that is for the corner, it's again you drag and drop event with some limits, and then it's just setting the value of the position to the value of the corner. So you can see it's very simple to create these seemingly complex interactions by just assigning the position of an object to the size of another object, or even the round corners in this case. Alright, that's how you can use variables to create the different interactions by triggering changes on your variables, or capturing the changes of other variables and assigning the values of them using the events and actions. I hope you like this tutorial and that you can keep exploring how to use variables to create many more interactions. Please let us know in the comments what you think about this, and I'll see you in the next time. Bye bye.